Welcome to Making Therapy Better, the podcast that brings together some of the top minds in psychotherapy as well as everyday clinicians to talk about where the field is headed and how we can achieve better mental health care for everyone. Making Therapy Better is hosted by Professor Bruce Wample, who has dedicated his career to understanding how therapy works and advocating evidence-based methods for improving outcomes. His guest today is Edward Hagen, Ph.D. Ed received his doctorate in anthropology from UC Santa Barbara, after which he worked at the Institute for Theoretical Biology in Berlin. He is currently a professor of evolutionary anthropology and director of the Bioanthropology Lab at Washington State University Vancouver. His research focuses on evolutionary medicine and finding evolutionary explanations for the origins of substance use and other mental health issues. His work challenges the notion that depression is caused by a dysfunction of the brain and argues that it is likely an adaptive response passed down through natural selection. Making Therapy Better is brought to you by CarePaths. CarePaths has been helping in-person and virtual therapy practices thrive for over 20 years with their complete web-based EHR and practice management platform. As mental health care evolves, CarePaths is leading the way in making measurement-based care easy and cost-effective for therapists. Visit carepaths.com to sign up for a free trial today. And now, without further ado, episode 13 of Making Therapy Better, The Evolution of Depression, with Edward Hagen, Ph.D.
So Ed, I'm excited to spend an hour talking with you today. You're a professor of anthropology at Washington State University with an emphasis in evolutionary anthropology. And on your website, you say you're interested in and focus on evolutionary medicine. You know, in the podcast that we're doing for Making Therapy Better, the guests have all been clinicians or psychotherapy, mental health researchers, and the audience as well. So in season 2, I'm really eager to talk to people in allied fields to give us a greater perspective on what we're doing. So what is evolutionary anthropology, evolutionary medicine? And what is it you do? So just fill us in a little bit.
Yeah. So evolutionary anthropology is an attempt to understand us humans as one species among literally millions of species on this planet. And how did we evolve from the single-celled organisms that all life forms evolved from to where we are today? And that's a complex task. We're really more at the beginning of that task than toward the end, I would say. But we have a lot of traits. As we begin to compare humans to other species, we see that we have a lot of traits that we share with other species. If we look at primates, vision, we all have vision. We have hearing, we have smell, we have muscles, skeletons. If we expanded our horizons to plants, we're multicellular organisms with many of the same functions and features. But we also have some key differences. So our close relatives are quadrupeds, we're bipeds. Our closest relative, the chimpanzees, our brains are about 3 times bigger than theirs. We have language, they don't, and so forth. So it's trying to understand both why we share many, many traits with other species, but we've also evolved some very, very distinctive traits, and we're trying to understand how those came about as well. So we use a range of evidence from fossil evidence, genetic evidence, behavioral evidence, to begin to try and triangulate and get some purchase on these questions. And most of them are still open questions. And the area that I focus on is human behavior rather than fossils or genetics, and trying to understand our behavior in evolutionary terms. And our behaviors, many of them are very similar to other species. We all eat, we need food, we all seek out sex, we all seek out safety. That will be maybe an important theme in the conversation today. We have bad things happen to us. There's a lot of similarities there, but of course some differences. as well. So it's trying to understand the patterns that we see in this broad evolutionary perspective. So that's evolutionary anthropology. Evolutionary medicine is the attempt to take all of that understanding and see if it can give us insight into medical problems that have been really intractable. We've done a pretty good job, pandemic notwithstanding, from dealing with infectious disease. We figured out what causes them. We didn't know for thousands of years. Now we do. And that gives us a lot of angles and tools to attack them. But there's a lot of diseases that we haven't made much progress on, or very slow progress: cancer, heart disease, stroke. And some of the most intractable problems where we've really made no progress whatsoever are mental health problems.
Yeah.
So my gamble, the way I'm gambling my career, is that evolutionary theory will maybe give us some clues to understanding and therefore helping folks with mental health problems. So have we got there yet? No. But do we have some ideas? Yes.
Yeah, and the ideas are fascinating, and we're going to get into those in this discussion. And I think they have implications both for how we do research, but importantly for clinical work as well. And as you say, we're kind of at the beginning of this, so we'll take it a few steps at a time. Before we get started, because people in the mental health field don't know you as well as my other guests, I read, like myself, you have an undergraduate degree in mathematics. You worked in a polymer lab doing some pretty cool fabrications. But how did you get into this field of evolutionary anthropology, particularly as it relates to mental health?
Yeah, it was a circuitous route. I was your typical geek teenager. I liked rockets and robots and computers and science fiction. So I always thought I would have a career in the natural sciences. So when I started at UC Berkeley back in 1980, I majored in physics and math, thinking that that would be my path. But what I discovered is after I would do my homework, I really wasn't thinking about physics and math. I was thinking about what I would now call human nature, the human condition. And that's what really gripped me. But it took a long time because all of my background and reading and education had really been in the natural sciences. And I didn't have any idea, I didn't know anything about the humanities or the social sciences. And yet it was those classes that really fascinated me. So over a long, I got my degree in math, and I took a job in the polymer lab just because I needed some income. And it was really fascinating because in the polymer lab, you're kind of geeking out at the molecular level. You're making gizmos and gadgets with molecules rather than transistors and circuit boards. So it was really intellectually satisfying on the one hand, but it really wasn't my main interest. So when I was working in the polymer lab, I snuck off to classes by linguists, George Lakoff, John Searle, anthropologists, Brent Berlin, and began to realize that if I really wanted to make some contribution to understanding human nature, that it was anthropologists that were really taking a perspective of humans as one species among many. And I thought that's really the direction that I'm interested in going. So it was a long, slow shift, but I have no regrets.
Yeah, fascinating. I like to tell people I never took a psychology course as an undergraduate.
Yeah, I didn't.
So it's a perspective that I think gives us a slightly different view of our subject. In your blogs and in many of your articles, you make the claim that mental disorders are not brain diseases or illness in the way they're sometimes conceptualized. So this is interesting. What's the evidence for this? How do you support the claim that particularly major depressive disorder and the depressive disorders in general are not brain diseases?
Yeah, so let me qualify that first. I actually do think things like schizophrenia and autism and bipolar are genuine brain disorders. And so the number of disorders that I would say are not are relatively limited. I would say most cases of depression probably are not. Most cases of anxiety probably are not. Most cases of PTSD probably are not. And maybe most cases of ADHD are not. But other than those, I would say, yeah, there really are brain disorders, and we've identified many of them, and we're making some progress, especially with a lot of the new genetics data that's coming down the pipeline. But focusing on depression, which is the area that I've really focused on, several things really stand out and distinguish depression from things like schizophrenia and autism and bipolar. And the first thing that really stands out is depression is way more common. So if we look at schizophrenia and autism and bipolar, roughly, depending on the study, let's say 1% prevalence rate each, just in rough terms. Depression at least 10 times higher than that. So that's interesting. And then a second big difference is if we look at those first disorders, autism, schizophrenia, bipolar, they're highly heritable, 80% roughly. Whereas when we look at depression, it's not very heritable. And the heritability, the high heritability of things like schizophrenia really suggests that genetic mutations are playing a really important role. And a lot of the new genetic evidence really supports that view that specific kinds of genetic mutations, or depending, sometimes specific, or sometimes they're kind of spread across the genome. But we really are beginning to discover that genetic load, as it's called, plays a critical role in those diseases. And that means consequently the environment doesn't play much of a role. Depression's the opposite. The heritability is pretty low. There is some, but it's less than half of what we see in these other illnesses. And the role of the environment is substantial. And we know what the environmental factors are in depression. We know that it's adversity, that it's negative life events, the death of a loved one, loss of a job, marital problems, divorce, physical assault, sexual assault. We know what the environmental factors are. And these are the kinds of things that happen to us repeatedly. Everybody that has ever lived has had a close loved one die. Everybody that has ever lived probably has had some relationship problems. Everybody has probably had to deal at some point with physical threats, maybe not actually suffering an assault, but at least maybe in fear of one. So these are things that would have been very, very common over our evolutionary history, and they would have had a big impact on our fitness, on our biological fitness. So when we see a really common condition like depression being caused by really common adversities that would have had a big impact on fitness, it's really worth thinking, could that depressive response be an adaptive response? Mm-hmm. And when we look at it, one of the main features of depression is low mood or sad mood. And the way that I like to think of it, this comes from, many people have proposed this, but I like to credit Randy Thornhill with this, is the notion that we can kind of conceptualize that as a form of pain, as psychological pain that is very analogous to physical pain. When we suffer some kind of physical injury, we feel physical pain, and that physical pain actually is adaptive. It helps us focus our attention on the problem and begin to deal with it. And I think it's a really strong hypothesis that the low mood and sadness that we feel with life adversities like marital problems or death of a loved one have a very similar role, a very similar function to physical pain. They focus our attention on the problem. They tell us that something is going wrong, something that could have a really big negative impact on our biological fitness or would have over our evolutionary history, and that we need to deal with it. We can't just ignore it. There's a problem here that needs to be addressed, just like a broken ankle or a broken knee or a cut or a burn or any other kind of physical injury. We also need to deal with these life adversities. So it's that kind of argument that has led me to the hypothesis, and I would like to frame it as a hypothesis, that a lot of depression is actually an adaptive response to adversity rather than a maladaptive one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. There's also this age of onset, which is closely related to what you said. The onset of episodes of depression, particularly first episode, are or occur across the lifespan. So it's not onset in adolescence, young adulthood, like schizophrenia, for example.
Yeah, and that's a really important point that you brought up, is that things like autism and schizophrenia have these sort of stereotypical developmental path trajectories, and they're lifelong conditions. You don't recover from schizophrenia in a couple months. And with depression, what we see is that the vast majority of cases, they can onset at any point in your life, as you just pointed out. That's really important. But they're not lifelong conditions, typically, with important exceptions. Typically, in the typical cases that we see in the community, folks will suffer a depressive episode for typically a few months, maybe up to a year for most of them, rarely longer than that. We recover fully from depression in a way that we don't fully recover from schizophrenia or autism or bipolar disorder, typically.
Well, we are going to discuss the dysfunction of depression, but let's talk about the adaptive response. And as you described it, it's a signal to the organism, the human, to address a problem in their life. This adverse event has created some kind of stress, some kind of conflict, and that needs attention. So that's kind of an internal signal. So as people suffer this sadness and depressed mood in response to an adverse event, what is it they typically do? How is the response actually adaptive? So how could actually feeling sad, not finding pleasure in activities, low energy levels be adaptive?
Yeah, so there's several different components to this. The first and most simple is just feeling sad is telling you that something is wrong. And so that is maybe the first and most important symptom, that you need to recognize that something bad is happening before you can really respond to it effectively. So that signal is to focus your attention on the problem. And what we see that many, many folks suffering depression begin to ruminate. And this is building on work or drawing on work from my colleague, Paul Andrews, who's really focused on this dimension of depression, which is rumination. If these were easy problems to solve, you would solve them pretty quickly. But in many cases, what we see is that these are not easy problems to solve. So if you are a parent and you have several kids with your spouse and your spouse dies, you've got a big problem. How can you care and raise these kids by yourself? And that's not an easy problem to solve. So you need to begin to intensively think about what you're going to do now that your life circumstances have changed dramatically for the worse. But that doesn't mean you can't recover, but it's not obvious what you have to do. And that's going to take a long thought process, probably days or weeks or even months of beginning to rearrange your life, maybe your career, your draw on certain kinds of social relationships. Maybe you have to move back closer to other family members. All kinds of major, difficult to make changes may be necessary to deal with an adversity of that magnitude. And you need to really think about all the consequences of making this decision versus that decision, and quitting your job versus not quitting your job, and taking out a second mortgage on the house or not doing that, or moving back closer to family members or not. And so this is going to require a lot of rumination on all the potential options that you have and all of those consequences. And that's exactly what we see folks with depression doing in many, many cases. They're beginning to focus and ruminate heavily on these genuine and hard to solve problems. And that's what Paul Andrews has found quite a bit of evidence for. And in fact, rumination, which many have kind of characterized as a maladaptive, you should stop thinking about all these negative things. And Paul rightly points out, no, if you want to solve these things, you have to focus your attention on these negative things. And it's not going to be easy. So those would be those two things, the psychological pain, focusing your attention, and then the rumination, beginning to really deeply analyze all of the issues to come up with some good solutions. Now, loss of interest, it kind of depends. Like if you are in a bad marriage, you might get depressed, and maybe you should begin to lose interest in some of these things that aren't working out for you, and maybe begin to shift your activities and interests in other directions. So some loss of interest might be recognizing that certain activities that you've been engaging in aren't paying off. And so Randy Nesse, another one of my colleagues, has kind of put a lot of effort into thinking about that sort of approach. But you really, if something in your life is not working, you may need to stop. So not only do you need to think about things, but you kind of stop a lot of the stuff that you're doing that might not really be leading to a good outcome, and begin to focus on options that may improve your circumstances. So that would be another thing. And then the final thing I'd raise here, and we might talk more about this in a bit, but when you get a physical injury, you're doing a lot of those same things. And so this is the analogy between physical pain and psychological pain. There are a lot of kind of functional similarities, I would say, there. And one of the things you do with physical pain is you signal others, in many cases, that you are suffering physical pain. You may kind of yell out or cry or have, grimaced expressions. And this is social signaling. And the reason is that to deal with physical injuries, we often need help from other people to deal with those, especially for like young kids, but even older adults may, if you break your ankle and you're stuck somewhere, you may really need some help to get out of that situation. And the same is true with other kinds of life adversity. You may not be able to solve the problem on your own, and you may need to signal to your social partners that you are in a bad situation. And so a lot of the symptoms of depression might be not just this internal signal that something's going wrong, but signaling social partners that something's going wrong as well.
Well, Ed, this is a pretty radical notion to many of us clinicians, that we want to help depressed people have their symptoms remit as fast as possible. The depressed mood interferes with social relationships. It clouds our judgment. We think about things in a disordered way. And you're really giving a perspective with evidence that these may well be adaptive traits. This internal and external signaling is important for appraising the life circumstances, making decisions that are adaptive in the long run for the person. So I just want to comment. This is different for us in many ways.
It is different. My sense is that a lot of clinicians intuitively intuit this. These folks, are devoting their lives to. I don't do therapy, but I have talked to many therapists and seen them in action in many cases, and they are really trying to help their clients, and I do sense that many of them kind of intuit what I'm saying. So I don't think I'm diverging as radically as you might think. Yeah. You may know better than I do on this. Where I see the divergence is really kind of at the theoretical and research level that does not incorporate these perspectives. So I much more deal with research of depression rather than the practicalities of treating with it. And when I look through the research literature, I don't see these ideas coming through at all in the theories that are being used to design various kinds of studies and therapies. So you see tons of stuff on the neurobiology of depression, variations on, a chemical imbalance model, to put it crudely. I see tons of studies on the genetics, again, looking for, genetic mutations that may predispose to depression. Again, kind of a dysfunctional view. I see many things on, cognitive deficits. So I don't see at this theoretical level and the kinds of theories that are driving. The U.S. funds depression research to the tune of almost now $500 million every single year from the NIH. It's really an enormous amount. And what's driving that research is really this dysfunction model. But I suspect, and maybe you would know better than I, but that at the clinical level, when you're dealing with real patients, you may at least intuit that they're not completely crazy, and that the things that they're really focusing on, there's a reason. There are maybe some good reasons why they're focusing on those things, and it's trying to discover those underlying reasons, which may not always be easy to discover in a lot of cases.
Well, it's interesting because Tom Insult, the former head of the NIMH, said the focus on biomarkers and the neuroscience of many mental disorders has put our focus in appropriate places. But let's come back to this idea of the adaptive part of depression. And I think the implications, not just for research, but for clinical practice. So the kind of analogy that I think about it is fever as an adaptive response to infection, some pathogen. So the fever helps to mitigate the effects of the pathogen. But if you remove the fever with analgesics, for instance, you may actually prolong the disease because that adaptive feature now is attenuated. And so the fever is not doing its adaptive idea. So could we be doing something similar in treatments of depression? So, we're kind of required to identify what is the primary outcome in our studies. And typically for all disorders, but for depressive disorders particularly, it's symptoms. So any kind of study, we want to see if we can make the symptoms remit as quickly as possible. And the discussion we're having is saying this may be leading to prolonging the disorder because it interrupts this kind of ruminative, problem-solving aspect of the depression.
Yeah, absolutely. So my understanding of medicine is the prime directive, if you will, is first do no harm. And I think that we haven't really, in mental health research, thought about that as carefully as maybe we should, because you're right. If depression is adaptive, as I think it is in many, many cases, the vast majority of cases, then by blunting those symptoms, we are, exactly as you say, preventing them from doing their job, which is likely to solve really tough life problems that, fluoxetine is not going to solve, or a few weeks of therapy aren't going to solve. And so do I know that that's true? No. Do I think it's a serious concern that hasn't been addressed? Yes. I really do think that we have jumped too quickly to assuming that these symptoms are maladaptive. And how do we alleviate them as quickly as possible, either with drugs or with therapy? And there's a real concern that we're not, that we may be doing some harm here, serious harm to patients by preventing them from really fully grappling with their current situation. So, there is, there are studies, and I haven't dug into this deeply enough to know, but does seem to be evidence that there might be remissions are more likely following antidepressant treatment only compared to, let's say, talk therapy, which should suggest that by briefly alleviating the symptoms, your symptoms go down for the next few weeks, but then you're still in the same situation you were when you entered therapy or entered treatment, and you actually haven't fixed anything. So I do think that that's a possibility that needs to be taken much more seriously than it has been in mental health research.
Yeah. Well, we do know that the relapse rates are greater for antidepressant medication when it's discontinued than it is for psychotherapy. And it may be that psychotherapy provides a opportunity to actually talk about these problems, solve the problems, make reasonable and adapted decisions. So there's more to the relapse than just the acquisition and opportunity to do problem solving. But that could be a large part of this. So I think clinicians would say to you, well, yeah, I agree with this adaptive response. For many people have an episode of depression, they recover, they don't suffer another episode, at least for a long period of time, till another adverse event. But the people we see in clinical practice are chronic. They have multiple depressive episodes across the life course, many of which do not seem to be caused by, or preceded by at least, major adversity. It's some kind of minor insult or circumstance or perceived adversity that sets off the episode. So these people are different. This is major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant disorder, chronic depression, however you want to call it. They're different. What do you say to that?
Yeah, what do I say to that? I have three responses to that. So first, all adaptive mechanisms can malfunction. So we can have as you brought up in some of our earlier emails, autoimmune. So we have an immune system. We would all be dead pretty quickly without it. It's not pleasant. Much of our illnesses are actually our immune systems activating and fighting off a pathogen. So much of what we might think of as disease symptoms, the fever is a great example here. It's not fun, but it's helping us. And that's true with a lot of the symptoms that we experience during an infectious disease, is that's really our immune systems going to town on that pathogen. And so if we didn't have that, we'd be in much, much worse shape. Despite all that, our immune systems can activate when they shouldn't. Any system that is meant to protect you, there's going to be a signal detection problem. And it might be detecting a problem when there really isn't one, and you then have an autoimmune disorder. And that could equally be true with depression. There's an equal signal problem. Is the situation as bad as I think it is? How should our knobs and sensitivities be set to respond to adversities? And we could easily imagine that knob is turned a little bit too far to the right or left. And some folks might not get depressed easily enough. Mm-hmm. They maybe should be more depressed than they are. But others might be triggering too easily and too quickly, just as our immune systems can overreact to allergens and other things in our environment, and often cause a lot of distress. So that is going to be equally true, or should be equally true with depression, that may be triggering when it doesn't. So that would be, yes, those are genuine, just as autoimmune disorders are genuine disorders. Those cases of depression would be genuine disorders. That should be a relatively small minority of cases if the theory is correct here, just as autoimmune disorders, although they are increasing and they have been increasing for a while, probably due to evolutionarily novel environments. By and large, most of our immune systems do a pretty good job of, most people have gotten COVID, most people didn't die of COVID. Go ahead.
But the autoimmune disorders are often genetic in origin, whereas, chronic depression is characterized often by traumatic events early in life, neglect, child neglect, difficult family of origin issues. So it seems like there's more of an environmental influence on the kind of dysregulated depression than there might be for autoimmune disorders.
I don't know. Yeah, go ahead. Finish.
Yeah. Well, you were going to say, I don't know if I agree. So
I don't agree. Yeah. So
okay,
I think there's quite strong epidemiological evidence that there are pretty substantial differences in the prevalences of autoimmune disorders in rural versus urban populations, in low-income countries versus high-income countries, for example. And we see the rates increasing as countries develop and westernize and develop more westernized. And so I think there's a lot of evidence that autoimmune disorders are heavily environmental. But as you just mentioned, they often do, just as we see with mental health, and here's where I'll make the analogy, are related to childhood experiences. But with autoimmune disorders, it's when you're growing up, what was your exposure to various allergens and pathogens? So if you were in kind of a rural, high pathogen environment growing up, your immune system is going to be calibrated very, very differently than it is if you're growing up in a high income, very clean, sterile, modern, urban environment. And so it's that calibration of your immune system that occurs across development that does seem to play a huge role in autoimmune disorders. And that's strictly environmental, but it's not a short-term environmental thing. It's one that is acted across your entire period of development. And that could be something very similar to what we were seeing with depression and mental health, that if you have a lot of childhood adversity, that may be calibrating your psychological defense systems in a very different way than folks that didn't have that. You may realize that you can't count on your family members to help you. They may actually be a source of costs rather than benefits. Or they may be unreliable. And that might mean that you are calibrating yourself for a lifetime of a very different kind of set of social resources than those of us that have been fortunate enough to grow up in really supportive families. So again, do I know that that's true? No. But do I think that that could be a model for thinking about the vulnerabilities that are instilled by these childhood adversities for adult onset of depression? Yeah, I do think it could be.
Yeah, we learn patterns of behavior and attachment and expectations for what others are going to provide for us
exactly
over the course of development. And I like the idea that it isn't just one event, although we know death of a parent in developmental period, that's a single event, but the consequences of that go on for some time, because if your mother dies, you're denied that maternal attachment that you would have had. So it's a single event, but it's really the implications or the experience of it over an extended period of time.
Yeah, and if we think about human evolution, and this is where the evolutionary part comes in, these days, if you live in a rich, high-income country and one parent dies, you're probably still going to make it to adulthood. But over our evolution, if your mom died, especially when you were really young, child mortality rates were really, really high. A lot of things would end your life pretty quickly, and without a mom or a caretaker to provide food and protection, and through nursing provide a lot of antibodies and other sources of benefits, your risk of dying may have increased dramatically. And so our psychology may be tuned to that past environment rather than a modern environment where the death of a parent is still really bad, but maybe not as catastrophic as it would have been over our evolutionary history.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, you're really pointing out the importance of thinking of this in an evolutionary way, because we think about death of a parent. There are other people to fill in, grandparents who probably weren't alive during much of human history, others in the community. But it's our evolutionary mechanisms and equipment that really make this a more salient event than it might have been.
Exactly. And the same would have been true if your spouse leaves you. So today we might think, hey, there's lots of fish in the sea. We've got all these dating apps, and it's easy enough to find another mate. But in the small communities in which we evolved, your spouse leaves you, there's not a pool of hundreds of potential mates that are not already paired up. It's not necessarily going to be easy to find another mate. And so, again, the psychological distress that most of us feel during a breakup probably reflects just how bad that could have been over our evolutionary history in terms of how are we going to now take care of the kids that we may already have together. That's going to become tremendously more difficult. There aren't, kindergartens that I can just drop them off at. Now there's one person trying to care for this person, one primary caretaker instead of two or three, depending on the other caretakers in our environment. And there's not necessarily, easy replacements out there. So we really do need to think about adversities in terms of what the impact would have been over the course of human evolution, not just how bad they seem to us today. And that can give a really different perspective on just how bad some of these things really would have been over our evolution.
Let's come back to this idea of calibration, because you mentioned something that I think is very interesting, and that is there may be a proportion of the population that doesn't experience an adaptive depression. So they have an adversive event, but they don't feel the symptoms of depression, and they don't go through the problem-solving rumination, examination that's necessary probably for changing a pattern that we make in life. And these might be the people who, growing up, didn't face any adversity. They were in a protected environment. And there's some evidence for this, that children need to face challenges, social challenges particularly, to be able to adapt. And this idea of depression and as a problem-solving strategy may be related to that. So those people, and I think we see them in clinical practice, who don't get themselves in a lot of trouble, social relationships, for example, without a sufficient period of really examining what the context is, what the general pattern of responding is, and what we need to do differently in the future.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's the notion of calibration. So that's, I think, one really important thing to think about when we think about the range of kinds of cases of depression that we see, or the lack of depression that we think we should see and we don't see. And if depression is maladaptively not triggering, what we might predict is we're going to see these folks repeating the same patterns over and over and over, kind of getting into bad relationships, or getting into relationships, having them go south, and then ending up rejected, and then going through it again, getting the next person, making the same mistakes over and over and over. So in the cases where we see people making the same mistakes over and over and over, that's where we would maybe want to suspect that some of these learning mechanisms that are critical, sort of psychological pain-driven learning mechanisms, aren't functioning in the way that we would hope they would, for folks to correct course. Now, I sort of said I was going to give you three answers. Why do we see these intractable cases, which really don't look adaptive? And I would agree. So one of them is, we have genuine misfiring, as we have in autoimmune disorders. One reason might be this calibration issue. But there can be genetic mutations and other things that disrupt our psychological mechanisms. So there could easily be, just as you pointed out, immune disorders could be due to this calibration issue, but they could also be due to genetic mutations that disable aspects of our immune system and lead to these disorders. The same could be true with depression. There undoubtedly are going to be mutations out there that do increase vulnerability for depression one way or another and cause it to trigger when it's probably maladaptive to do so. So I think that's reasonable. Again, those should be pretty rare, because if those mutations were common, they should have been selected out of the population by and large, if my hypothesis here is correct. Another thing I would say is there's many pathways to depression and genetic pathways. So the genetic mutations might not be in the depression mechanism themselves, but in your social mechanisms. So you keep screwing up your relationships because you have some mutations in your social psychology that causes you to keep, screwing up your relationships with people, which then lead to adaptive depressions. But depressions where you can't really fix things because you've got some problem somewhere else. So there are the many, many genetic pathways to depression, not all of them directly implicating the depressive mechanisms themselves, but other functional mechanisms and psychologies that may cause us to kind of select ourselves into depressogenic situations. And so that could be another pathway that people kind of just keep heading down the same path, but the real problem is in, their social psychology, not depression itself. So that could be another reason that we see these intractable cases. Another one that I would like folks to think about, and this leads to one of my main themes in my research, is that, and there's two dimensions of this. One is that we may not, when we identify adversities, we use our folk intuitions about what is bad. So your parent is dying, I can intuit why that's bad, or you lose your job, or your wife leaves you, or somebody important dies. We can all intuit those. But there may well be circumstances that were really bad, but are rare enough or unique enough that it's hard for us to put ourselves in that other person's shoes. So they may be suffering an adversity that's a real adversity, but it's not one that most of us have experienced or that they can even put into words. That may be really bad for them. I'll just give you one possible example from, and actually one of the cases that kind of got me thinking about this whole area. But a good friend of mine many, many, many years ago just was one of these folks that seemed to be having these recurrent intractable depressions, didn't seem to be related to anything. But I knew this person really, really well, and she was super smart, super bright, thoughtful, and her brain was not obviously malfunctioning. And so I wondered, could there be some deeper problem here that's difficult to recognize? And again, I think a lot of therapists, this is exactly the path they go down to try and intuit what's really going on with this person's life. And I don't know if I got the right answer, but what I really thought I perceived was her mood would just be, she'd be kind of her mood would skyrocket when her father would give her attention, but then her mom would always shut that off. So I kind of got the sense she was in this competition with her mother for her father's attention. Now, whether that's definitely, being the armchair psychologist here, Am I right or am I wrong? I don't know. But from an evolutionary perspective, I could begin to see it. The father's investment could either go to the mother or his offspring. And if father's investment is kind of limited, there could be a competition between an older daughter and her mother for investment. Is the dad going to invest in his adult daughter or his wife? And they could be in competition for those resources. And that's what I think was going on in this case. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it's an example of perhaps a kind of adversity that is not a common one, but could nevertheless have been something that really would have been devastating over evolutionary history. If you need this investment and you're not getting it, and your own mother is your main competitor, so your mother, rather than investing with you and being a caretaker and an investor in your future, is in fact a competitor with you for the critical resources you need. And she would obviously be a very formidable competitor to have. So it could be that some of these intractable cases are because there are problems that we aren't recognizing and therefore aren't providing the resources that folks need to solve them. And this one also gives us a second kind of related idea that there's a conflict here. There's a genuine conflict between the daughter and her mother over the dad's investment. And the mother really needed the father's investment, and the daughter really needed it. They both really needed that investment, and it was a zero-sum situation. And there's no easy way to solve that. And there are many, and this is where my main contribution, I think, to kind of the evolutionary literature on depression is the role of conflicts of interest in depression. So one of the things is, what's the difference between just kind of normal, what we might call normal low mood that all of us have experienced when bad things happen to us, and what seems to be this deeper, more painful, more intractable, major depression, loss of interest, often suicidality, really what seems kind of self-harmful and self-destructive behaviors. And what I'm proposing is this genuine conflicts of interest, that when we suffer adversities, we often need help from others, and there's going to often be conflicts of interest that are going to prevent that help from being provided. And it's those conflicts which make a lot of these depressions intractable, because the conflicts are intractable. And just to give an example, I gave the daughter-mother example, but just a more common one, if your spouse leaves you, if you don't have an option to get another spouse, it was in her interest to leave you. It's not in your interest that she left you. But there's no easy way to solve that conflict. It's definitely in her interest to go, and it's definitely in your interest that she not go. And if there aren't other options out there, you're between a rock and a hard place here. There's no easy way to solve that conflict. And so a lot of the intractable depressions, I think, have their origins in these intractable conflicts of interest, where what is good for one person is bad for another, and vice versa. And therapists can't solve that, and drugs can't solve that. It's kind of the painful aspect of being a human, that we're often dealing with intractable conflicts between individuals where we need something, and it's not in that person's interest to give it to us.
Yeah, interesting. And we do understand that, I think, in psychotherapy, but we also try to think about ways to overcome this being stuck between the conflict of what's in the best interest, and develop new patterns. So you mentioned, I'm not able to find a new spouse or a new significant other, but that may be due to kind of deficits in social relationships. It may be deficits in the way we think about it. It may be defenses we learned as children. So there is an opportunity, I think, in psychotherapy, even for these intractable cases you describe, to learn something new so that our responses are more adaptive and that we actually do something that produces an outcome that's in our best interest.
Yeah. Well, depression wouldn't have evolved if it didn't lead to better outcomes under my hypothesis. So even with these untractable cases, yes, there has to be some path forward, and depression has to have led you toward that path.
Yeah.
If I am right.
Yeah. Two important things I want to talk about here. One is the chronicity of the adversive events. We talk about death of a parent, and again, it's a single event, and the consequences of it may go on for some time. But there are people, due to life circumstances, that just have chronic adversity, social economic status, homelessness, racial inequalities or racial discrimination, harassment. These are chronic kinds of adversive situations. So it's not, I guess what I'm saying is we have to pay attention to the context as well as the kind of adaptive aspects of depression. So the locus of change may not be in the individual, but in the society, which creates the chronic adverse events.
And that's exactly the main focus of my research, is that to fix these problems often doesn't involve change. If you can change it, so the psychological pain hypothesis, me is proposing that by thinking about these problems, you can change yourself and solve them in some way. It may not be easy, may not be obvious, but there's something that you can do. You have the power somewhere to make some change, however difficult, that will lead you on a better path. But there may well, and often are, and this is where my work comes in, where you need other people to change. You are powerless to make the changes that need to happen to move forward. And so how can depression help change other people? So what we've talked about mostly here is how psychological pain allows you to learn and change your own behavior. But could it actually be useful to change other people that don't want to change? Could it somehow force them to change in ways that they don't want to change? And so my first work in this area was on postpartum depression. So depression suffered by mothers after the birth of a new child. And of course, all mothers are expecting and hoping to, love their new baby and have this great experience. But unfortunately, 10 or 15% of mothers instead feel depressed. And what the evidence overwhelmingly shows is that in many of these cases, they're not getting the social support they need, either from the husband or other family members. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe the husband left them when they found out they were pregnant. The partner left them. Or the partner has prioritizing other aspects. Maybe he has other kids. Maybe his family members need his attention. Maybe his career, he's focusing on his career, whatever it might be. So we have that conflict between the mother that needs more direct care after the birth of a child and her other family members who aren't providing that extra assistance that she needs. What power does she have to change their behavior? Not her own behavior, but their behavior. And what I argued in my early work on this is that those other family members share an interest in the outcome of that new infant. It's the husband's kid, it's the grandparents' kid, it's the aunts and uncles' niece or nephew. If they want that kid, and think about our evolutionary history, if they want that kid to survive, that mother better get what she needs. So her power to force other people to invest more in her is, if you don't help me more, I'm not going to take care of this kid. I'm not going to invest in the baby. And that's exactly what we see in postpartum depression. That mothers really reduce, you talked about loss of interest before. What's the function of that? Here is what I call my bargaining model. It's kind of like a going on strike idea here. The mother is like, if you don't invest in me, if you don't pay me the salary that I need in analogous terms here, I'm going to go on strike and not care for this kid. And if I don't care for this kid, it's not going to make it. So if you want your son to survive, or your daughter to survive, or your niece or nephew or grandchild to survive, you better invest more in me. And so the mother has power to change other people. And I think that is one of the functions of these kind of deep loss of interest that we see in many cases of depression, that we are all valuable to other people. We might be being exploited by them, and racial discrimination, you mentioned that, or low socioeconomic status is often economic exploitation, racial exploitation. But that means we're valuable. People are exploiting us because we provide value to them. And we can force them to change by withholding that value, either by becoming deeply depressed and not doing whatever it is they need us to do, take care of children, do our job, whatever it might be. Or in extreme cases, we can threaten to kill ourselves. If you don't change, I'm not going to be here and provide all these benefits that you're getting from me. So yes, sometimes depression can solve these conflicts, not by eliminating the symptoms, but by intensifying them, and showing others that if they don't change in ways that we need them to change, we are not going to continue providing them the benefits they're getting from us.
Pretty provocative ideas at the end, I think, in terms of withholding something from others in order to affect some change in them. I worked a long time in Norway part-time, and I think about the investment the society makes to parental care. I mean, there's 6 months of leave for each of the parents. It's just built so that that care is part of the system. We put parents, and mothers particularly, in a very stressful situation based on our model in the United States. One thing we didn't get to talk about is kind of social healing. And I think in the external signals and our efforts to get support from others touches on this. But if we get a chance to talk again, I would love to talk more about this idea that when we need help, psychic pain, we signal others for assistance. And that's something we did throughout our evolutionary history. There's other social species that have social healing practices. And psychotherapy, I'm kind of talking about my interests now. But so psychotherapy is a social healing process. It isn't just an opportunity to problem solve and learn new behavior and act in different ways, but the actual relationship is healing in itself, because we need that social aspect of healing, and psychotherapy provides it. So,
yeah, and I would endorse that those therapeutic relationships, that person becomes an important social ally. And so you may not have those alliances in your regular life, but if you can develop them in the therapeutic context, they can provide a lot of the same benefits. So I agree with that. The only thing I would caution there from my perspective is therapists have limited power, often no power, to actually change other important others in the patient's lives. And it might be those others that need to change. And so the lack of power that a therapist may face when dealing with the patient's problems may really put some limits around what they can actually accomplish.
Well, to be sure, we do have family counseling, which is an attempt to look at it more systemically. And even in individual therapy, thinking systemically and helping people learn the social skills they need to obtain the support they need is helpful. So there are ways that we do that explicitly. Ed, we're about out of time. This has been fascinating. I just think it's so important that we understand the evolutionary history of mental disorders, particularly depression. I think we've always thought of anxiety as a kind of dysfunctional adaptive response. But depression, we've really thought of it really from the dysfunction viewpoint rather than how can we harness the adaptive part of the response. So this is really helpful to us. And to the audience, I recommend you read some of Ed's papers. They're fascinating. I've spent the last weeks reading through them, and I've learned a lot. So I appreciate your contributions to our field.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. Making Therapy Better is brought to you by CarePaths. CarePaths offers a complete behavioral health EHR and practice management software solution, including claims, billing, clinical notes and documents, scheduling, and teletherapy, all for one simple and affordable monthly price. CarePaths EHR is HIPAA compliant and ONC certified, and can also support electronic prescribing for an additional fee. Their latest release, CarePaths Connect, includes automated measurement-based care and the ability to create a digital front door for your practice, as well as a free mobile app designed to increase patient engagement. If you're just starting your practice or are dissatisfied with your current EHR, go to carepaths.com to start your free trial today. To find out more about Bruce Wampold and his work as CarePaths Chief Clinical Officer, visit makingtherapybetter.com.